Hello, everyone. We are in a new chapter today, so something to get excited about. We're going to be starting chapter 6 today. This is going to be a two-part series, and the title of the chapter is Supply, Demand, and Government Policies. So if you like the exercise that we ended up doing last class with the illegal drug market, you'll like this chapter because it gets into how economics ties into politics. So just for your notes, this is chapter 6. Again, if you haven't read it, make sure you go in the textbook and read it. Supply, demand, and government policies. And the main type of policy we're going to be considering today are policies that impact the price. So we're going to call these price controls. And I'm going to start just kind of describing in very general language what price controls are, and then we'll give you some specific examples. So the idea of a price control is sometimes in a market you have an equilibrium. The equilibrium corresponds to a particular price. And then sometimes, for one reason or another, the government just isn't happy with that price. Maybe they think it's unfair for a buyer to have to pay that price. It's unfair for a seller to get that price. And so what a government might do in that kind of situation is they would come in and they would kind of push the market off of the equilibrium price by imposing some kind of price control. So an example we'll talk about later on in this class is the price for labor. So the price for labor is the wage rate you get. If you go to work and you get paid $8 an hour, then that is the price for your labor. So the government might say, well, we don't like that price. We think it's too low. And so they might go into the labor market and impose a minimum wage. And so that would be a way for them to kind of move the market away from its natural equilibrium, because they deem the price in the market, the wage rate, to be unfair. Okay, what I'm going to demonstrate to you today is a lot of times these price controls, while they may be very well intentioned, sometimes they can generate inequalities. So there's three types of price controls. Price type number one is a government could impose a price ceiling. Price ceiling is just what it sounds like. So it's a legal maximum amount at which a good can be sold. So it's a legal max or maximum on the price at which a good can be sold. So an example I'll give you later on in class is the market for gasoline. So at one point in our country's history, the United States thought the price for gasoline was too high. So they imposed a price ceiling, and they said, okay, gas stations, you cannot sell your gasoline more than this amount per gallon. That was a legal maximum on the price at which the good gasoline could be sold. That's an example of a price ceiling. The opposite of a price ceiling is a price floor. And a price floor is just going to be a legal minimum on the price at which a good can be sold. So the example I gave you like 2 minutes ago was the example of minimum wages. So minimum wages are an example of a price floor. The amount that you make for your job is kind of like the price of labor, and the government is actively debating whether or not there should be an increase in the price floor, the legal minimum price at which the good, your labor, can be sold or provided. Okay, the third type, which I'm just going to mention today, and then this will be next class, is taxes. So taxes effectively are a way to manipulate the price of something in a market, and they're a lot. There's a motorcycle going by, so it's hard to hear at the minute. So they're a little bit more difficult to model, so I'm just going to hold off on this until next class, and then we'll get back to taxes. But for today, we're going to be thinking about price ceilings and price floors. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of cases for both price ceilings and price floors, and these are going to be the possible situations that a market might find itself in if either a ceiling or a floor is imposed. Okay, so first of all, how price ceilings affect the market. So we'll start with ceilings affect the market. Okay, case number one is that it could be the case that the price ceiling is not binding. So I'm going to write and then explain. So a not binding price ceiling would be one at which the ceiling is set above the equilibrium price in the market. And in this case, it's not going to have any impact on the price or the quantity at which goods are sold at. So this case occurs when the ceiling is set above the equilibrium price. And then the result of this is that there's no effect on the price or the quantity that is sold. Okay, let me give you an example of this. So suppose you have a market for something. So maybe this is the market for motorcycles. And there's an original equilibrium right here. So you have Q units and motorcycles that are exchanged at a price of P star. Okay, the government comes in and they set a price ceiling that's above the equilibrium price. Well, maybe if each motorcycle is being sold at $30,000, and the government comes in and makes a regulation and says, okay, motorcycle manufacturers, you cannot sell your motorcycles for more than $200,000. So $200,000 is way up here. So here's where the ceiling is at. Well, they're already doing that, right? So already without the government's policy, they're selling way below the ceiling. And so when the ceiling is set above the equilibrium price, it's just business as normal. Like, we don't need to adjust anything because we're already kind of abiding below the ceiling. Okay, case number two, however, is we could have a price ceiling that is binding. So case two is to have a binding price ceiling. Okay, a binding price ceiling is going to pop up anytime the government comes in and they set a price ceiling that's below the equilibrium price in the market. So, so just descriptively, so these occur when the ceiling is set below the equilibrium price. And this will lead to a shortage. So I'm going to show you how this works. Actually, let me give you one more piece of information, and then I'll show you how it works. This is going to cause sellers to ration the scarce good. Scarce is with a C, good. Okay, so suppose you've got this market for motorcycles again. Suppose originally there's an equilibrium price of $30,000. Okay, now let's say the government comes in and they say we're going to impose a price ceiling that's at $10,000. So this is going to be the legal maximum amount at which motorcycles can be sold at. So now we have a ceiling that's right here. Okay, this creates some problems, right? Because right now motorcycles are going at a rate of $30,000, but the government's saying, wait, can't sell them for more than $10,000. Well, we've kind of already talked about how this would affect things. So the supply of motorcycles would be some pretty low amount, because who wants to sell their motorcycle at only $10,000 a piece? Whereas if motorcycles are really cheap, then the demand is going to be quite large, and so the quantity demanded is going to exceed the quantity supplied. And so the extent of the difference between the quantity demanded and quantity supplied is going to be the amount of the shortage that we have in the market. So what this means is, among the few people who are willing to actually sell their motorcycle at $10,000 per motorcycle, they're going to have this long line of customers who want to buy these motorcycles at $10,000. And so the sellers who are actually willing to sell their motorcycle at that low price are going to have they're not just going to have the ability, they're going to have to like sit and ration their motorcycles across these gobs of people because not everybody's going to get one. And so this is what happens if you have a price ceiling that's set in the market that's below the equilibrium price. Okay, case number, so this is price ceilings, case 1, case 2. Now let's look at how price floors affect the market. So again, a price floor is just kind of the opposite of a price ceiling. So how price floors affect the market is going to be kind of similar to the way price ceilings affect the market, just backwards. So case number 1 is you could have a price floor that's imposed that is not binding. Okay, a price floor will not be binding if it is set below the equilibrium price. And if this is the case, then there's going to be no effect on the equilibrium price in the market, or the price that materializes in the market, or the quantity that is sold in the market. So, okay, let's think about the picture for this now. Suppose we're thinking about motorcycle market. We've got this original setup where the equilibrium price is $30,000 per motorcycle, and now the government comes in, and let's say they set a floor, which is another way of the government of saying that the government comes in and says you can't sell your motorcycles for less than this amount. Like, you've got to prop the price up to a certain amount. And the place they set the floor is below the equilibrium price. So maybe they set a floor at $10,000. Okay, if this is now a floor instead of a ceiling, well, now this is an entirely new game, because all this means is that the government says, okay, manufacturers of motorcycles, don't sell your motorcycles for less than $10,000. And then the manufacturers of motorcycles look back and they're like, got it, like, we're not doing that anyways. And so they just keep on going, selling their motorcycles at $30,000. They sell this many units. And so this floor is not binding because the floor is set underneath the equilibrium price. Okay, case number 2 is that the government could impose a price floor that is above the equilibrium price, and this would be binding. So case 2 is a case of binding price floors. We will end up with a binding price floor when the price floor is set above the equilibrium price. Okay, this will kind of affect things. So this is going to lead to a surplus. And what this means is that some sellers are going to be able to sell the items that they're offering for sale and they want to sell. So, in words, some sellers are unable to sell what they want. Okay, the idea for this is we've got this motorcycle market, and originally, again, we're at a price of $30,000. This is the equilibrium. And now let's think about what happens if the government sets a price floor that's above the equilibrium price. Well, if the government comes in and sets a price floor at $100,000, then we've got this floor up here. This is not drawn to scale. And this floor means that no one's allowed to sell their motorcycle for less than this. We can't go underneath the floor. Well, this is problematic because we're underneath the floor. And so all of the exchanges are going to have to get propped up to this floor. And if this is the new going price for motorcycles, well, this is going to be the new number or quantity of motorcycles that are demanded. And it makes sense that this is small, right? Because if motorcycles are being sold at a really high amount, not very many people want to get one. And then this is going to be the new quantity of motorcycles that's supplied, which again makes sense that this is high, because if I'm Harley Davidson and the government says, like, you can't sell your motorcycles for less than $100,000, well, if I could get $100,000 for every motorcycle, like, I'd be willing to sell a ton of them. So again, what we've already learned is that when there's a disparity between the quantity demanded and quantity supplied, and the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded, then we have a surplus. And the amount of the surplus is just the difference between these two quantities. And so some of the sellers are unable to sell what they want because they want to sell this many. They're only able to sell this many, so they got this many left over. Okay, so this part of it isn't terribly tricky, but here's where it's kind of cool when you think about how this plays into politics. So as I mentioned, at some point in history, the United States government decided that consumers shouldn't have to pay lots of money for gasoline for their cars. And so they attempted to come into the gasoline market and control the price, and this kind of backfired. So I'm going to give you this example here. So example number one is, this is a price ceiling example. Okay, actually let me kind of tell you a story and then I'll actually draw the picture. So the idea again is that the government decided, we don't want consumers paying a whole lot of money for gasoline to drive around. So we're going to create a ceiling for gasoline so that if the price ever creeps up to this amount, then it's going to have to stop there and it won't be able to exceed this threshold. Well, it worked okay for a while, but then what ended up happening in the market for crude oil is that the price of crude oil spiked. And crude oil is an input to gasoline. So this impacted or shifted the supply curve for gasoline. And as I'll show you in a minute, everything just kind of fell apart and the government ended up having to come back and repeal the regulation. Okay, so here's the story. So price ceiling on gasoline. Okay, so originally we had a equilibrium price for gasoline that was at P star. Okay, originally the government came in and they set a price ceiling at a level that was above the equilibrium. Okay, note that this is not binding, right? So the policy is just saying you can't sell your gasoline for any more than this. This is the ceiling. This is the max amount you can charge. But the market was well below the ceiling, so you didn't really have to do anything in the short run. But kind of the nice thing about the idea of this was they thought, well, if at some point something changes the market and prices start creeping up, then the price ceiling will kind of be the brakes in the system that prevent consumers from getting exploited and having to pay a huge amount of price for gasoline. Okay, the problem was that what happened was that the price of crude oil spiked. Okay, again, crude oil is an input for gasoline. So you need crude oil as like an ingredient that you need to make gasoline. So this impacted the suppliers. Okay, recall, if one of your inputs has a price increase, then what happens to your overall supply? You just supply less. And so what happened in the gasoline market was that the supply of gasoline shifted left because of this increase in the price of crude oil. And we ended up with a supply curve that was out here. Okay, this is problematic now, right? Because what we would like to do is we'd like to move our crosshairs from here to here, and we'd like to end up at a price up here, but this price is above the ceiling, and so this is problematic because you can't charge the equilibrium prices the market would like. So if this is kind of the new equilibrium, I'm not saying we have it, but this would be the new equilibrium, price star star, but this is the ceiling. Well, now suddenly we're in a situation where now the ceiling is binding. And so what we have now is that if this is the supply and this is the demand, so again, this one's no longer relevant, then the market cannot legally exchange gasoline at this price. It has to stick down here at the ceiling. And so at this ceiling, this is the number of units of gasoline that are demanded, whereas this is the number of units of gasoline that are supplied. And if you have a quantity demanded that exceeds a quantity supplied, well, what you're going to get is a shortage. And this is what ended up happening in the gasoline market. So suddenly there was like a shortage of gasoline. People who needed to like fill up their tanks just couldn't. Like there wasn't enough gasoline at the pumps for them to get. And the government realized like this wasn't good because like we wanted to protect the consumer, but suddenly when there was this like secondary effect in the market where the crude oil prices spike, now there's people who like want to buy gasoline. They would actually be willing to pay a higher price, but the people who want gasoline aren't actually getting gasoline. And so at the end of the day, the government decided to repeal this policy. And now there is no price ceiling in the gasoline market. Okay, so another example is the example of minimum wages. So this is one flavor of a price floor. So example number 2 is an example of a price floor, and this is the case of minimum wages. Okay, when we're thinking about wages, wages are actually equivalent to a price when we're looking at the labor market. So the idea is there's some people who supply their labor. These are workers. There are some people who demand labor. These are the employers. And the price at which labor is exchanged is the wage rate. Okay, so here is kind of what would happen in a market if there's a minimum wage that is imposed. So first of all, we're going to have quantity, and the quantity is going to correspond to the quantity of labor. So this is like, or I should put laborers. So this is like the number of workers. Okay, the price, I'll put this in parentheses, is equal to the wage rate. And in parentheses, it could be hours worked or number of workers. And so what's going to be true in any market is that there's going to be some equilibrium that just exists. So suppose in some market there's this many people that are working, and the equilibrium price is like $8 an hour, just for an example. Okay, this is not a political statement. This is just kind of like how economists think about minimum wages. The concern most economists have with minimum wages is that in the absence of government intervention, the market actually just kind of like maneuvers itself to get to the equilibrium. And so anytime there's any kind of government intervention that pushes the market off its equilibrium, you end up with some kind of offness. So the offness that would occur if you kind of disrupt a market that's in equilibrium is if the government comes and says, okay, minimum wage is going to be set at $15, which is above the equilibrium price, then if that is the new price floor, then that means it is illegal for employers to pay their workers anything less than $15. So you think about people who are working like at movie theaters, like if you're working at a movie theater, equilibrium wage rate is pretty low. Like they're not willing to pay people that much, and high school students are happy to work for not that much. So the equilibrium is usually kind of low. If the government said we're going to have a price floor in the labor market of something that's higher than the equilibrium, so maybe $15, well, what would happen is, first of all, the demanders of the workers, so these are like the movie theaters who are hiring the high schoolers, they're not going to want to hire as many people. So this is going to be the quantity demanded, or the number of workers, this in parentheses, the number of workers employers want to hire, to hire. And then at this new price floor, this is going to be the quantity of labor that is supplied. So again, who supplies labor? People who work. So in the case of the labor market for working in a movie theater, these are going to be the high schoolers who are wanting the job. And this should make sense, I'll point out. Because if you're a high schooler and suddenly there's an increase in the minimum wage and Like before, if you worked at a movie theater, you're only making $8 an hour, but now if you work at a movie theater, you're making $50 an hour. A whole bunch more high schoolers want to like start working because the wage rate is pretty high, and so the quantity of suppliers of labor increases. So this is like the number of people who want to work. And now we've got a problem, right? Because now there's this many people who want jobs, there's this many jobs to be had, so there's going to be a shortage of jobs, and specifically a labor shortage is equivalent to the number of people unemployed, or the unemployment number. So before, if like this leg was like 6 units long, we would say this is the number of units that were short. And the labor market, what 6 would mean is that these are the number of people who want to be working and who can't find a job. So this is where economists sometimes get a little bit leery about minimum wages, because conceptually, this model would tell us that if you set a minimum wage above the equilibrium price, then for the people who have a job, it's great, but it's also going to ramp up the unemployment. Okay, so this is a real-life example of how economics actually plays in. So I'm going to stop there. If you have any questions about any of this, let me know, and then after 10 minutes, we'll meet back for the exercise. The exercise today is going to be to think about how different types of policies would affect market. So what I have is a market that I've carefully drawn with coordinates. And so the first question is, I want you to think about what would happen if the government sets a price ceiling of $5? And the question is just what would happen in the market. So options for answers are number one, nothing. So this might not be binding. Option number two is there could be a shortage of a particular amount. Option number three is there could be a surplus of a particular amount. Question number two is consider the effect of a $5 price floor, and then a $2 price ceiling and a $2 price floor. And then once you're good with this, you're good for the day.